Copper pans rang against the flagstones as a sauceboat overturned into the fire, and for one suspended second, the entire kitchen of Elverton House went as still as the ballroom 2 floors above, every hand frozen, every eye fixed on the narrow door that had just swung open at the top of the servants' stairs. It was not Cook who stood in that doorway, and it was not a footman sent down with a complaint about the second course. It was the Duke of Elverton himself, still in his white gloves, looking down into a room no guest of his had ever once troubled himself to enter. Upstairs, 40 guests were still exclaiming over the pear tart that had somehow, impossibly, arrived at the table crisp and golden, despite the hours earlier disaster, unaware that the cook they toasted with raised glasses had been carried out an hour before, too unsteady on brandy to stand, and that the dish now melting on their tongues had been rescued by hands no one at that table had ever once bothered to learn the name of. Below all that admiration, Adelaide Fenwick stood at the scarred work table with flour to her elbows and a burn already rising pink across one wrist, too tired to notice the door, too intent on rescuing the last course to hear her own name pass, for the first time in 3 years, through the mouth of a duke standing in a kitchen. She had never once expected him to enter, let alone remember afterward at all. To understand why a duke who had not set foot below his own stairs in a decade would leave 300 guests mid-dinner to find a scullery maid, it is necessary to go back to that morning when the invitation cards for the harvest ball had arrived at Redmayne Court, and Adelaide's aunt struck her name from the guest list before the ink upon it had even properly dried. The invitation came sealed in cream and gold, carried up the drive at Redmayne Court by a rider in Elverton livery, and Lady Redmayne received it in the morning room with the particular reverence she reserved for anything that might finally deliver her daughter a title. The Duke of Elverton was to dine at Redmayne Court on his way south, the letter explained, a courtesy call arranged through her late husband's cousin. And though the visit was framed as nothing more than an old family connection being honored, Lady Redmayne read between every line of it a proposal already half made. She spent the better part of an hour reading the guest list aloud to Philippa, savoring each name the way other women savored sweets. And it was Adelaide, standing near the door with the morning's mending still folded over her arm, who noticed that her own name did not appear among them, though she had lived under that roof for 3 years and eaten at that family's table every single night since her father's estate had been sold to cover his debts. She said nothing. She had learned, in 3 years, precisely how little saying something ever changed. It was Philippa who noticed her noticing, and who could never resist the particular pleasure of saying aloud what her mother preferred to leave merely implied. "Your name was never going to be on it," Philippa said, not unkindly exactly, the way one states a fact about the weather. A duke does not dine beside his tenant's discarded relations. Lady Redmayne did not correct her daughter. She folded the letter instead and told Adelaide, without quite meeting her eyes, that Cook would want an extra pair of capable hands for a dinner of this consequence, given that the girl who usually helped below stairs had taken ill that very week, and that Adelaide's presence in the kitchens would therefore be far more useful to the household than her presence at the table ever could be. It was not phrased as a punishment. It never was. Adelaide understood all the same, exactly what it meant to be told 3 years running that her usefulness only ever began where her visibility ended, and she folded the mending in her arms a little tighter and said that of course she would help cook, because there was no version of that sentence in which refusing had ever once been offered to her as a real option. The kitchens of Redmayne Court were already a furnace of anticipation by the time Adelaide came down the back stairs, still in her plain gray morning dress, ribbons of steam curling from 3 enormous pots, and the whole staff moving in the particular, controlled panic of a household, about to be judged by people who had never once had to cook a meal themselves. Betsy, the youngest of the kitchen maids and the only person under that roof who had never learned to treat Adelaide as furniture, caught her arm at the doorway and said, low and worried, that Mrs. Dunmore had been at the cooking sherry since noon and was in no state to manage a dinner for 30, let alone one meant to impress a duke, and that nobody dared tell the housekeeper for fear of what Lady Redmayne would do to all of them if the evening went wrong. Adelaide had spent 3 years in that kitchen without ever once being permitted to touch the good copper pans reserved for company dinners. But she had spent the 7 years before that at her mother's elbow, in a kitchen far humbler and far happier, learning to coax a sauce back from the edge of curdling, and to judge an oven's heat by the color of its coals rather than any clock. Skills her mother had never once explained the origin of beyond saying. With a private smile, Adelaide had not understood as a child that she had learned them somewhere finer than either of them would ever again have cause to mention. Adelaide had assumed all those years that her mother meant only pride, the small vanity of a woman making the best of reduced circumstances. She rolled her sleeves to the elbow now and moved toward the ovens without waiting to be asked, because whatever waited for her in that kitchen tonight, doing nothing, had never once in her life been the safer choice, and because some old, well-worn part of her still came alive, despite everything, at the smell of butter turning gold in a pan. Mrs. Dunmore, swaying gently over the stock pot, waved a spoon at her without much interest and told her to see to the sauce for the second course. And Adelaide, tying an apron over a dress that had never been meant for a duke's dinner, felt something in her chest settle for the first time all day. The strange, private calm of being handed the one task in that entire house she actually knew how to do well. By 6 o'clock, the first carriages were rolling up the gravel drive, and the whole of Redmayne Court had transformed itself into the particular gleaming falseness of a house pretending, for one evening, that nothing about it had ever needed reduced circumstances or careful economy. Lady Redmayne stood at the top of the front steps in her best silk, rehearsing under her breath the exact angle at which she intended to present Philippa to a man the county had spent a fortnight discussing in hushed, admiring tones, for the Duke of Elverton was known everywhere as a man of considerable fortune and considerably less patience, a landlord who inspected his own tenant farms, rather than trusting his stewards, a guest who had more than once left a dinner table the moment the conversation turned to flattery rather than substance. It was whispered, though never confirmed, that he had once dismissed an entire kitchen staff at his London house, not for any dish gone wrong, but for a dish gone falsely praised, that he could tell, apparently, the difference between food cooked with genuine care and food cooked merely to impress, and that this single peculiar talent had made him nearly impossible to entertain. Lady Redmayne considered this rumor an inconvenience to be managed rather than a warning to be heeded, certain that money spent freely enough could disguise any deficiency in the kitchens below, and she had spent an unconscionable sum on delicacies from London to prove it. What she did not know, because it was not the sort of thing whispered in drawing rooms, was that the Duke of Elverton's particular talent for tasting sincerity in food had not been acquired at any of the great tables of his own upbringing, but somewhere considerably lower in his father's house, in a kitchen not unlike the one currently filling with smoke 2 floors beneath her silk slippers. For Lady Redmayne, the evening carried a single design beneath its silk and candlelight, that a duke who dined once at Redmayne Court might be persuaded to call again, and that a second visit, skillfully managed, might in time deliver Philippa a coronet no amount of pin money could otherwise purchase. Adelaide, 2 floors below, in an apron already dusted with flour, had no design at all beyond getting the sauce right and the pastry risen. And it did not occur to her, stirring cream slowly over a low flame, that the evening's true verdict would be decided far more by her own steady hands than by any word her aunt might manage to say. Beyond the family's own ambitions, half the county had turned out that evening specifically to observe the Duke of Elverton at close range, for a man so rarely seen in company invited endless speculation about his tastes, his temper, and the peculiar fact that he had never once, in 10 years since inheriting his title, been known to court a single woman past a second dance, a detail that made Lady Redmayne's hopes for Philippa considerably more audacious than she cared to admit aloud even to herself. Neighboring families arrived early and lingered long in the entrance hall on invented pretenses, hoping for a glimpse of a man whose portrait, commissioned once and then quietly removed from public view, had become something of a minor legend among the daughters of 3 counties, each of them certain that whatever coldness the gossip described could surely be thawed by the right conversation, the right dress, the right moment of candlelight. None of them, watching him move through the receiving line with unhurried formal courtesy, guessed that the coldness they found so intriguing had been built, brick by careful brick, over exactly the kind of dinners this one was working so hard to imitate. The first course went up without incident, a clear soup that required little more than correct timing, and for a quarter of an hour, the kitchen allowed itself the small, cautious relief of a household that believed the worst might yet be avoided. It did not last. Mrs. Dunmore, flushed and increasingly unsteady on her feet, mistook the sugar for salt while finishing the fish course's butter sauce, and did not notice her error until Adelaide, tasting it on instinct rather than instruction, caught the wrongness on her tongue and quietly remade the entire pan from scratch before a single spoonful could leave the kitchen, saying nothing to Mrs. Dunmore beyond a gentle suggestion that she rest her feet a moment by the fire. Betsy, watching this from across the room with something between alarm and awe, whispered that Adelaide had likely just saved the whole family from a fish course fit only for pigs, and Adelaide, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of one floured wrist, felt no triumph in it at all. Only the familiar, weary certainty that whatever she saved tonight would be credited, as everything in that house always was, to someone else's name. She had no way of knowing, ladling the corrected sauce into its silver boat, that upstairs a duke known for detecting exactly this kind of quiet dishonesty in food had just taken his first spoonful of it and gone very still, setting down his own spoon with the unhurried attention of a man who had tasted, after years of polite and forgettable dinners, something that was not merely competent, but true. In the scullery behind her, a low, ominous crackle rose from the great bread oven, where a batch of pastry had been left too long by a kitchen boy sent running for more cream. A small failure that would, within the hour, become considerably larger, though neither Adelaide nor anyone else below stairs had yet noticed the thin curl of dark smoke beginning to gather beneath the oven's iron door. The smoke thickened faster than anyone expected, and within minutes the scullery boy's shout brought half the kitchen running to find flames licking hungrily around the oven door, the pastry inside already lost, black smoke rolling up toward the low-beamed ceiling in a way that made Betsy scream for water before anyone had thought to fetch any. Adelaide reached the oven first, wrenching the door open with a cloth wrapped twice around her hand, and smothering the worst of the flame with a wet sack kept for exactly such emergencies. Coughing hard in the sudden black cloud that rolled out to meet her, her eyes streaming, her wrist already blistering where an ember had caught the thin skin above her glove. It was in the middle of this chaos, with smoke still hanging low over the work tables and half the pastry course reduced to cinders, that Mrs. Dunmore finally gave out entirely, sliding without warning from her stool to the flagstones in a dead faint that owed rather more to brandy than to shock, and had to be carried bodily from the kitchen by two footmen who exchanged a look over her head that said plainly neither of them expected her to be fit for duty again that night. For one long, terrible moment, the kitchen simply stood still, a dozen frightened people looking at one another across a ruined pastry course and a half-finished dinner for 30 guests, waiting for someone, anyone, to say what came next. And it was Adelaide, wiping soot from her face with a sleeve already ruined beyond saving, who heard herself say it before she had entirely decided to. "We start the pastry again," she said, "and someone fetch more cream. And Betsy, you're with me at the stove. And if anyone upstairs asks why the third course is late, tell them the kitchen is managing it, because it will be, because I am not letting this family go down for want of a duke's dessert." Nobody argued. In the sudden silence of a kitchen with no one left to give orders but her, Adelaide realized, with a strange lightness that had nothing to do with the smoke still stinging her eyes, that for the first time in 3 years under that roof, every single person in the room was looking to her and waiting, quite genuinely, to be told what to do. What followed was 2 hours that Adelaide would later remember only in fragments, sharp, bright pieces of heat and flour, and the particular focused calm that came over her whenever her hands were busy enough to outrun her thoughts. She remade the pastry from scratch, watched the butter and sugar for the caramel, with the patience her mother had once called the only patience worth having, and when Betsy asked, breathless, whether there was even time left to attempt the pear tart still listed on the dinner's careful menu, Adelaide found herself reaching instead for a recipe no menu in that house had ever specified, a spiced pear and honey tart, finished with a thin ribbon of brown butter that her mother had taught her over a much smaller stove, years before poverty and grief had taken that kitchen from them both. a dish her mother had always made exactly the same way, murmuring, half to herself, that it was the one thing she had carried out of her old life worth keeping. Betsy watched Adelaide work the pastry with quiet, practiced speed and said, wonderingly, that she had never in her life seen anyone handle a tart shell like that. That even Mrs. Dunmore on her best day couldn't manage that particular fold of the crust. And Adelaide only shrugged and said her mother had taught her, though she did not say because she had never fully understood it herself, that her mother had always refused to say precisely where she herself had learned it. The tart came out of the oven gleaming in gold, the honey glaze setting to a soft shine, the whole kitchen filling with a smell so specific and so warm that even the exhausted footmen paused on their way through with empty trays to breathe it in. And Adelaide, sliding it carefully onto the good silver stand reserved for company, allowed herself, for one unguarded moment, something close to pride, without any idea at all that the smell rising from that tart was about to travel up 2 flights of stairs and undo in a single bite. 10 years of careful, guarded silence in a man she had never once met. Betsy, still catching her breath from the earlier fire, lingered by the work table a moment longer than the work required, watching Adelaide wipe down the last of the flour with the particular satisfaction of someone who had just watched a disaster turn, improbably, into something close to triumph, and said quietly that she hoped whatever else happened that night, someone upstairs thought to mention whose hands had actually saved their precious dinner. Adelaide only laughed, tired and hollow, and said that hoping for that particular kindness from that particular house had stopped being worth the disappointment years ago, though some small, stubborn part of her, watching the tart's glaze catch the firelight one last time before it left her hands for good, found itself hoping anyway. Upstairs, the dining room had by then settled into the particular glow of a dinner, going better than anyone had dared hope, crystal-catching candlelight, Lady Redmayne accepting compliments on courses she had never once entered a kitchen to inspect, with the practiced modesty of a woman thoroughly enjoying credit she had not earned. Philippa, seated at the Duke's right hand, exactly as her mother had maneuvered, kept up a steady stream of admiring conversation about music in London and the weather on the road south. And the Duke of Elverton answered her with the correct, distant courtesy of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than pursuing an interest, his attention returning again and again, without his quite meaning it to, toward his own plate. It was the fish course that first caught him, a butter sauce with a particular balance he had not tasted since before he could properly remember tasting anything at all. And he set down his spoon for a long moment afterward and said nothing, telling himself it was only coincidence, the sort of trick a tired traveler's memory sometimes plays. But when the pear tart arrived at last, set down before him, with the honey glaze still faintly warm and the smell of brown butter rising unmistakably from its crust, something in his chest went entirely still, and for one disorienting instant, he was not 30 years old in a stranger's dining room, but 7 years old again, sitting on an upturned crate in a kitchen far from any drawing room, watching a woman he had loved fiercely and briefly slide exactly this tart from exactly this kind of oven. Every course that evening had arrived at its precise, practiced interval, 5 minutes between removing one dish and presenting the next. A rhythm dictated not by the guests above, but by an unspoken hierarchy below stairs in which a butler's nod outranked a housekeeper's wish, and a housekeeper's wish outranked anything a scullery maid might think to suggest. And it was a mark of how thoroughly that hierarchy had been upended in the last 2 hours, that the pear tart now cooling on his fork had been decided upon, prepared, and sent up entirely on the authority of a young woman who held no rank in that kitchen at all beyond the rank she had simply taken when no one else remained to claim it. The Duke's own hand, steady through years of managing an estate twice the size of most dukedoms, had gone unmistakably unsteady around the stem of his wine glass, a small betrayal he covered by setting it down before anyone at the table could notice. Though Simmons, watching from his post along the wall, with the particular attentiveness of a valet who had served this man since boyhood, noticed it immediately and filed it away as something worth remembering. Lady Redmayne, catching his stillness and mistaking it entirely for admiration, asked brightly whether his grace was enjoying the tart, and the Duke, recovering himself with visible effort, asked instead, in a voice gone suddenly quite careful, who precisely in her household had made it. Lady Redmayne, who could not for her life have named a single dish on her own table without consulting the menu card, answered smoothly that her cook was a treasure they had kept for years. A woman of considerable skill, trained originally in London, and moved the conversation swiftly onward to safer ground, before any further question could expose how little she actually knew of what happened 2 floors beneath her own dinner parties. The Duke did not press her further at the table, though something in his expression, careful as it remained, suggested he had not entirely believed the answer, and he ate the remainder of the tart in a silence Philippa mistook for contentment, and Lady Redmayne mistook for triumph. It was his own valet Simmons, who unknowingly undid the careful fiction some 20 minutes later, leaning close to murmur that there had been some difficulty below, stairs earlier in the evening, a small fire, and the cook taken ill. And that word among the staff was that the young miss of the house, the poor relation nobody at dinner had thought to mention, had single-handedly saved the meal from ruin with her own 2 hands. The Duke set down his wineglass very carefully, thanked Simmons in a voice that gave nothing away, and sat through the remainder of the final course with the particular stillness of a man doing a great deal of thinking behind an entirely composed face, until at last, as the guests began rising for the ballroom and the musicians struck their first tentative notes, he excused himself from Philippa's side with a courtesy so brief it left her faintly startled and turned in front of a room full of guests who had never once seen him. Leave a table before dessert had properly concluded toward the narrow door at the far end of the hall that led unmistakably down. The servants' stairwell was narrower and darker than any staircase the Duke of Elverton had descended in a decade, lit only by a single tallow candle at the turn, and he found himself, halfway down, oddly grateful for the dark, as though it gave him a moment longer to decide what exactly he meant to do once he reached the bottom. It struck him, passing a landing whose worn stone steps dipped in the middle from generations of servants' feet, that he had not needed anyone to direct him toward this particular staircase at all, that his own feet had simply known, without conscious thought, precisely how many turns separated a duke's dining room from a kitchen. Most gentlemen of his rank had never once set foot inside, an unthinking certainty that unsettled him rather more than the conversation waiting at the bottom. The kitchen door swung open beneath his hand into a wall of heat and noise that stopped dead the instant every person in that room turned and saw who stood in the doorway. Copper pans mid-motion, a scullery boy frozen with an armload of dirty linen, the whole staff arranging itself instinctively into the careful, lowered postures reserved for gentry, who had wandered somewhere they were never meant to see, a posture drilled into every servant in that house from their first week of service. Eyes down, hands still, breath held, because Lady Redmayne had made unmistakably clear, in her own soft and unforgettable way, precisely what became of any servant who allowed a guest of consequence to see them as anything other than furniture, and not one person in that kitchen had the faintest idea what rule applied to a moment like this one, since nothing in 3 years of careful training had prepared them for a duke who had come down to find one of their own. Only Adelaide, bent over the work table, scrubbing the last of the pastry equipment with her sleeves still rolled and a raw burn reddening across one wrist, did not immediately look up, too tired and too intent on finishing, before the household could accuse her of leaving a mess behind her, until the silence around her grew strange enough that she finally lifted her head and found herself looking directly into the eyes of a duke she had spent the entire evening cooking for, and had never once expected to meet. "Your Grace," she said, straightening quickly and wiping flour from her hands onto an apron already beyond rescuing, "is something wrong with the dinner?" The Duke, who had come down 3 flights of stairs with a dozen careful questions prepared, found every one of them momentarily driven from his mind by the sheer, unguarded ordinariness of the woman standing in front of him, exhausted and singed and entirely unaware that she had just undone 10 years of his own careful silence with a single pear tart. Behind them, the kitchen staff had gone very still, uncertain whether the proper response to a duke lingering unbidden in their domain was to continue their work as though nothing were amiss, or to withdraw entirely and leave him whatever privacy his rank implied he was owed. And it was Betsy, of all people, who settled the matter by quietly herding the scullery boy and 2 hovering footmen toward the far end of the kitchen with nothing more than a sharp look. The same unspoken authority Adelaide had claimed over the pastry an hour before now, passing briefly and without comment, to the girl who had learned it by watching her. "Nothing is wrong with the dinner," the Duke said, and something almost like a laugh moved briefly through the words. "Everything is entirely right with the dinner, which is precisely the difficulty, because I have not tasted a pear tart made exactly like that one in over 20 years, and I find myself very much wanting to know where you learned to make it." Adelaide, still faintly certain this entire conversation was some elaborate misunderstanding about to end badly, answered honestly that her mother had taught her, years ago, before hardship and then illness had taken first their fortune and then her mother herself, and that she had never known anyone else make the tart quite that way, because her mother had always been strangely private about where she had first learned it, saying only that she had once worked in a very fine kitchen indeed, long before she married. The Duke went very still at that, in a way Adelaide could not yet interpret, and asked, with a carefulness that seemed entirely out of proportion to so small a question, what her mother's name had been. "Margaret," Adelaide answered, watching his face for some explanation she could not yet guess at. "Margaret Fenwick, though her name before she married was Yarrow." The Duke did not answer at once. He stood very still in the doorway of a kitchen, 2 floors beneath a ballroom full of guests he had entirely forgotten, staring at a young woman with flour on her hands and her chin lifted in the same stubborn, unbothered way he suddenly, dizzyingly remembered from another woman entirely. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had gone rough, in a way none of his staff upstairs would ever have recognized as belonging to him at all. "Say that name again," he said. "Please." His hand, still gloved, had found the doorframe beside him, without his quite noticing, gripping it the way a man grips something solid when the ground beneath him has just, without warning, shifted. The Duke did not immediately explain himself, needing a moment visibly to gather words for a story he had not spoken aloud in longer than Adelaide had been alive, and when he finally did speak, it was quietly, the practiced coldness of a man used to command entirely absent from his voice. His mother had died, he told her, when he was 7 years old, and his father, unable or unwilling to look at a boy who resembled her too closely, had sent him not away to relatives as convention demanded, but simply downward into the least regarded wing of his own great house, where a cook named Margaret Yarrow had taken him in without any instruction to do so, beyond her own unasked-for kindness, feeding him at the kitchen table because no one had thought to arrange anywhere else for him to eat, teaching him to fold pastry and judge an oven's heat because it kept his small hands busy and his grief occupied, treating him, for nearly 3 years, exactly like a boy rather than an heir. He told Adelaide about the specific fold of that pear tart's crust, a trick Margaret Yarrow had shown him 100 times on a stool beside her own work table, about the particular way she had hummed while she worked, about the fierce, unglamorous tenderness of a woman who had never once seemed to care what his title would eventually be, only whether he had eaten enough and slept enough and cried enough of his grief out before bedtime. He told her, too, the part he had never told anyone at all, that Margaret Yarrow had left Elverton House rather suddenly when he was 10, called away for reasons never fully explained to a boy that age, and that he had grieved her leaving nearly as hard as he had grieved his own mother, and had spent years afterward in every kitchen of every house he ever visited, tasting quietly and hopelessly for some trace of the woman who had actually raised him, without ever once finding it until tonight. He remembered, too, the exact morning Margaret Yarrow had first let him stand on the stool beside her, small and grieving and useless at everything else in that vast cold house, and had handed him a wooden spoon with the flat, unsentimental instruction to stir until his arm ached and his thoughts quieted. A lesson he had carried with him, unnamed, into every difficult room he had entered since, boardrooms and drawing rooms and funerals alike, long after he had stopped consciously remembering where the habit came from. He had never told a single soul at either of his houses that the Duke of Elverton, so admired for his composure under any provocation, owed that composure entirely to a cook who had taught a heartbroken boy that grief, like a sauce threatening to curdle, could be coaxed back from disaster with nothing more than patience and steady hands. And he found it strange, standing now in a kitchen not unlike hers, that the first person he had ever told was a young woman who had learned the very same lesson from the very same hands. Adelaide stood very still through the whole of it, feeling something long buried in her own chest come loose and rearrange itself entirely, because she had spent her whole childhood hearing her mother speak always briefly and always with a strange private warmth, of a boy she had once helped raise in a grand house whose name she never mentioned. A boy her mother had called only once, in a rare unguarded moment near the end of her illness. The nearest thing to a second son she had ever had, and Adelaide understood now, with a clarity that made her hands tremble against her apron, exactly whose face her mother must have pictured in that final year, while she thought no one else was listening. She told the Duke this, haltingly, watching something in his composed features finally, entirely break open, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything further at all, standing together in a kitchen, still faintly smelling of scorched pastry and rescued butter sauce. Two people who had each spent years believing themselves entirely alone in a particular grief, neither had ever expected the other to share. It was the sound of footsteps on the stairs above them, brisk and increasingly urgent, that finally broke the stillness, Lady Redmayne's voice already calling ahead in the bright, anxious tone of a hostess who had just realized her most important guest had vanished from his own ball for the better part of 20 minutes. And the Duke straightened at the sound, his face rearranging itself with visible effort, back into the careful, distant composure Adelaide now understood, for the first time, had never once been the whole truth of him. He looked at her for one last unguarded moment before the stairs delivered her aunt into the doorway. And Adelaide had no idea at all, watching that careful mask settle back over his features, whether what had just passed between them belonged now to the kitchen alone, or whether it was about to follow him back up into a ballroom that had never once thought to invite her. It was nearly 11 by then, the great kitchen clock ticking past the hour behind a wall of drying pots that would not see a clean rag until well past midnight. The fires already banked low by two exhausted footmen, who still faced a full washing up before any of the staff could think of their own beds, real unglamorous work that had nothing to do with dukes or dances at all, and everything to do with the ordinary machinery that kept a great house running long after its guests had stopped noticing it existed. Lady Redmayne arrived in the kitchen doorway, flushed and visibly displeased, taking in the scene before her. A Duke standing far too close to a scullery maid amid the wreckage of a kitchen that still smelled faintly of smoke, and arranged her face within a single breath into an expression of horrified apology entirely for the Duke's benefit. "Your Grace, I am so terribly sorry," she said, sweeping forward with the particular brightness of a woman papering over disaster. "I cannot imagine what possessed the girl to detain you down here among all this mess. She does tend to forget her place when left unsupervised." Turning to Adelaide with a sharpness that dropped every ounce of performance from her voice, she added that Adelaide had a great deal of cleaning left to finish and that she would do well to remember, going forward, that a guest of His Grace's consequence was never, under any circumstance, to be troubled by the household servants. Adelaide felt the old, familiar heat of humiliation rise in her face, the particular sting of being reduced, in a single sentence, back down to nothing at all in front of the one person that evening who had, for 20 extraordinary minutes, made her feel like something considerably more. And she began, out of 3 years of practiced habit, to lower her eyes and murmur an apology she did not actually feel. Behind Lady Redmayne, the kitchen staff who had spent the whole of that terrible, triumphant evening watching Adelaide command a crisis none of them could have managed alone, went very still in a different way now. The stillness not of deference, but of held breath, of people who had just watched a hierarchy they had lived inside their whole working lives, quietly, unmistakably reverse itself, and who understood, without needing to be told, that whatever happened in the next few seconds would decide which version of that hierarchy survived the night. She did not get the chance to finish it. "Madam," the Duke said, and something in the single flat word stopped Lady Redmayne entirely mid-sentence. "This young woman is not a servant who forgot her place tonight. She is the only reason your dinner did not end in ruin, and your family's name did not become the subject of every drawing room in the county by morning. And I would ask you to consider very carefully how you speak of her again in my presence." He did not explain, in that crowded doorway, exactly why the sight of a hostess scolding a servant for a moment's unearned kindness had struck him with such disproportionate force, did not tell Lady Redmayne that he had once been a boy fed at a kitchen table by a woman his own father had never once thought to thank, but something of that old private fury moved through his voice all the same, unmistakable to anyone who knew him well enough to hear it, though no one in that kitchen yet did. Lady Redmayne's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound at all, the color draining rapidly from a face that had, moments before, been arranging itself into practiced hostess warmth, and the kitchen staff, still frozen at their stations, exchanged glances that carried a full 3 years of unspoken grievance finally, silently, being vindicated. The Duke turned then to Adelaide, his voice softening entirely, and asked, with a formality that somehow felt more like tenderness than any casual warmth could have managed, whether she would do him the honor of coming upstairs, not to finish the household's cleaning, but to be properly introduced to his hostess's guests as the woman whose skill and whose mother's memory he had spent the whole of that dinner rediscovering. Adelaide looked down at her scorched, flour-dusted hands, at an apron entirely unfit for any ballroom in England, and hesitated only a moment before lifting her chin in the exact stubborn angle her mother had once taught a grieving boy to recognize, and said that she would need 1 minute to wash, and that after 3 years below stairs in that house, she intended to walk up those front stairs, for once, on her own 2 feet. Behind her, Betsy pressed both hands to her mouth to keep from cheering outright, and even the footman who had carried Mrs. Dunmore out barely 2 hours before exchanged a look that came as close to open delight as 3 years of careful household discipline had ever permitted them. Betsy found her a clean apron to at least wipe the worst of the flour from her hands and face, and pressed into her arms, at the last moment, a plain woolen shawl worked with a border of embroidered violets that had belonged, Betsy said quickly, to no one grand at all, only to her own grandmother, but that Adelaide ought to wear something of her own choosing up those stairs rather than nothing, and Adelaide took it with a gratitude too large for the small gift itself, because it was the first thing offered to her in that house in 3 years, with absolutely nothing expected in return. There was no time for anything more elaborate than a basin of water and a hurried scrub at the worst of the soot along her jaw. No maid free to arrange her hair beyond tucking the loosest pins back into place with fingers that still smelled faintly of browned butter. And Adelaide caught one brief glimpse of herself in the cracked scullery mirror, flushed and singed and entirely unrecognizable as anyone's idea of a Duke's dinner partner, before deciding, with the same practical resolve that had gotten her through the whole of that terrible evening, that it would simply have to do. She climbed the servants' stairs she had used 1,000 times before, past the narrow landing where she had once overheard her own name struck from a guest list she had never even known existed until that year, and emerged at last through the door she had entered only as a maid carrying trays, stepping instead directly into the blazing candlelit warmth of the ballroom itself, still faintly smelling of wood smoke and browned butter beneath Betsy's borrowed shawl, her hands rough and reddened and entirely without gloves, the most unglamorous guest that room had ever received. The music did not stop the way it had for grander dramas and grander houses, but the murmur of conversation faltered noticeably as heads turned, one by one, toward the doorway where a duke stood waiting, having crossed the floor to meet her the instant she appeared, offering his arm with a formality that made unmistakably clear to every single person watching exactly what he intended that gesture to mean. Philippa, who had spent the better part of the evening rehearsing exactly how she would describe this ball to every friend in London by week's end, watched from beside the refreshment table with an expression that curdled faster than any sauce in the kitchen below had ever threatened to, while her mother stood rigid and pale near the doorway, calculating with visible desperation how quickly this particular story could be reshaped into something that reflected well on the household rather than badly. The Duke led Adelaide not to some quiet corner where the scandal of her presence might be more easily managed, but directly into the center of the floor, where the musicians, catching the sudden charged silence of the room, struck up a slow, deliberate waltz clearly meant to hold the moment rather than rush past it. Behind the ballroom's far doors, unseen by the dancing pair, a handful of off-duty footmen, and even Mrs. Dunmore, roused from her disgrace by the commotion, had gathered to watch through the gap left by a door not quite closed, an audience no one upstairs would ever have thought to invite, witnessing from the shadows the same vindication the kitchen had already claimed for itself 2 floors below. Word passed low through the crowd, faster than any servant could have carried it deliberately, that the disheveled young woman on the Duke's arm was the very hand behind the extraordinary dinner they had all just praised without knowing whose skill they praised, that she was kin to the household rather than hired help, and that his grace, A man famous throughout 3 counties for never once dancing at any ball he attended had crossed an entire room to claim this particular partner before any other gentleman present had so much as noticed her arrival. Adelaide, feeling the weight of every eye in that ballroom for the first time in her life, turned toward her, not in judgment, but in open, startled curiosity, found herself unable to decide whether the unfamiliar heat rising in her chest was terror or something considerably closer to joy. And it was only when the Duke's hand settled warm and certain at her waist, drawing her into the first turn of the dance, that she allowed herself at last to believe that whatever this evening had become, it was not going to end with her sent quietly back down to the kitchens. Older guests who remembered the Duke's mother, decades gone now, murmured to one another that they had not seen that particular softness in an Elverton's eyes since before her death. And a few of the kinder ones, watching Adelaide's flushed, startled face turn slowly from terror towards something closer to wonder, found themselves smiling despite 3 years of having scarcely noticed the girl existed at all, the way a room sometimes only truly sees a person once someone else has first shown them where to look. When the dance ended, the Duke did not release her hand at once, keeping it instead lightly in his own as he turned to address, in a voice pitched precisely to carry to every corner of that ballroom, his gratitude to Lady Redmayne for an evening he would remember, he said, for reasons considerably deeper than her table's excellent food, and his particular hope that Miss Fenwick, whose late mother he had once had the great fortune to know, might be permitted to receive him when he called upon Redmayne Court again within the week, as he fully intended to do. He said nothing more specific than that to the assembled room, offering no explanation of what exactly he had meant by great fortune or by once had known her mother, because some truths he had decided somewhere on the walk back up those narrow stairs belonged only to the 2 people who had actually lived them, and he found he did not particularly care whether 300 guests spent the rest of the season inventing their own versions of a story that was, in its real shape, entirely his own to tell or withhold. Lady Redmayne, who understood perfectly well the difference between a courtesy and a declared intention, agreed with a speed that betrayed exactly how thoroughly her ambitions had rearranged themselves in the space of a single dance, already calculating how quickly Adelaide's plain gray dresses might be replaced with something more befitting a young woman a Duke intended to visit, already rehearsing, no doubt, an entirely new version of the evening's story, in which she herself had always known Adelaide's particular value. Philippa said nothing at all, standing very still near the refreshment table with the fixed, brittle smile of a young woman recalculating, in real time, the entire shape of her own future. And for one unguarded moment, Adelaide felt something almost like sympathy. For a cousin who had spent 3 years believing that cruelty toward her would cost nothing, only to discover in a single evening precisely how much it had actually cost. Around the room, older heads bent together in the particular fast, delighted murmur reserved for the best kind of scandal, the kind that cost the murmurers nothing, and promised weeks of retelling, while the household's own servants, permitted for once to linger near the ballroom's edges to watch the spectacle their own labor had made possible, exchanged glances that said, more plainly than any words could have, that the natural order of that house had just been quietly and permanently rearranged. Before the carriages began departing that night, the Duke asked to be shown below stairs one final time, not as a Duke inspecting a kitchen, but, he said quietly to a startled Betsy, as a man who understood better than most exactly how much an evening like this one owed to hands nobody upstairs had thought to thank, and he spent a full 10 minutes among the exhausted, soot-streaked staff, learning names, praising the specific dishes each of them had saved or rescued. He told the scullery boy, who had first raised the alarm on the oven fire, that his quick shout had very likely spared the whole east wing a far worse blaze than a ruined batch of pastry. And he told the 2 footmen who had carried Mrs. Dunmore out hours before, gently and without a trace of mockery, that carrying a burden with dignity was very often the hardest work done in any great house, and the least thanked for it. Before he left, he also left behind a sum of money for the kitchen staff's Christmas, that made even the unflappable Mrs. Dunmore, sobered now and thoroughly ashamed of her earlier collapse, blink back sudden tears. Adelaide watched him move through that kitchen with an ease that finally made complete sense to her. A man entirely comfortable among people whose labor others overlooked, because he had once been exactly such a person's whole world for 3 formative years. And she understood, watching him, that whatever had begun that night had not begun with a dance in a ballroom at all, but far earlier, with a woman named Margaret Yarrow, who had chosen, decades before either of their children were born, to love a grieving boy without once asking what it would cost her to do so. When the Duke finally took his leave, he paused at the kitchen door and looked back once more at Adelaide, standing amid the wreckage of the night's rescued dinner with Betsy's borrowed shawl still around her shoulders, and said only that he would see her again very soon, leaving the whole household, upstairs and down, to spend the rest of that night wondering exactly what soon might come to mean. Mrs. Dunmore, sobered and mortified in equal measure, found herself for the first time in longer than she could recall, genuinely uncertain whether she had spent that evening losing her position entirely or somehow improbably, keeping it only because a duke had chosen mercy over complaint. And she resolved, watching the kitchen door close behind him, that whatever came next, the cooking sherry would trouble that kitchen no further under her watch. The Duke called at Redmayne Court 3 times in the fortnight that followed, each visit a little longer than the last, and each time Lady Redmayne fluttered around the drawing room, rearranging the good china with an enthusiasm she had never once extended to Adelaide's actual presence in 3 years under that roof. Though Adelaide found, to her own quiet surprise, that she no longer particularly needed her aunt's approval to feel that something in her life had genuinely, permanently shifted. She and the Duke, whom she had by then learned to call William when no one else was present to hear it, spent those visits talking with an ease that had nothing to do with dukedoms or dinners at all, walking the modest gardens of Redmayne Court, while he told her more of Margaret Yarrow's kitchen, and she told him more of the small, humble years after her mother left service, each of them filling in, piece by careful piece, a story that had apparently been running in parallel for 20 years before either of them knew the other existed. Betsy, promoted quietly to the household's head kitchen maid, once Mrs. Dunmore's health made an early retirement necessary, took to reminding anyone who would listen that she had known from the very first night that Adelaide's tart would change something, though she was honest enough to admit she had expected the change to end with a raise in wages rather than a Duke's visiting card. Adelaide herself, standing one afternoon at the same work table where she had once scrubbed pans in silence and invisibility, found it strange and rather wonderful to realize that the skill her mother had passed down to her almost as an afterthought, a private inheritance from a life neither of them had ever expected to matter again, had turned out to be the one thing in that entire house that no one, not her aunt, not her cousin, not 3 years of quiet cruelty, had ever been able to take from her. Lady Redmayne, for her part, had undergone a transformation the household found almost too swift to be believed, addressing Adelaide now with a careful new warmth that fooled no one below stairs, least of all Betsy, who remarked more than once that it was remarkable how quickly a woman could rediscover her fondness for a niece the moment that niece began receiving a Duke's visiting card. Though even Betsy admitted, watching Adelaide move through the house with a new and unhurried ease, that it hardly mattered anymore whose affection was sincere and whose was merely convenient, because Adelaide herself had stopped needing either to feel, for the first time in 3 years, entirely and unmistakably at home in her own life. On his 4th visit, the Duke did not walk with her in the garden at all, but asked instead, quietly and without any of the practiced formality he still wore easily enough for the rest of the world, to see the kitchen one more time, and standing there among the copper pans in the low afternoon light, he told her that he had spent 20 years searching every grand kitchen in England for some trace of the woman who had actually raised him, and had never once considered, until the night of that ruined dinner, that what he had truly been searching for all along might not be a memory of Margaret Yarrow at all, but the daughter she had raised to be exactly as unflinching and exactly as generous as she had once been herself. He did not go down on one knee among the flower and the copper pots, because some formalities, he said, deserved a grander room than this one, but he took her hand, still faintly rough from years of work no lady of his acquaintance would ever have been asked to perform, and told her plainly that he intended to marry her, not despite the kitchen that had first revealed her, but because of it, and that he could not think of a single room in his own great house he would rather have first understood who she truly was. Adelaide, who had spent 3 years believing herself invisible in every room she ever entered, looked at the man standing in front of her, with flowers still faintly dusting the hem of his fine coat, from where he had leaned too close to the work table, and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had absolutely nothing left to hide and nothing left to prove. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light was already turning toward evening, gilding the copper pans the same warm gold it had gilded them the night everything changed, and Adelaide thought, holding William's rough, honest hand in her own scarred one, that it was fitting after all that a life spent unseen in the grandest rooms of that house should finally be claimed in the humblest one, among flower and firelight and the quiet, patient ghost of a woman who had loved them both first. If you have ever been the one sent to the kitchens while someone else took the credit for everything you built, tell us in the comments below exactly when the world finally noticed you, and subscribe for more stories about the ones who were overlooked, until at last, someone came looking.